Quick disclaimer before this video begins, this video will contain spoilers for God of War Ragnarok, which also means spoilers for the games before it. So if you do care about these characters enough to watch a video like this, and you have not beat Ragnarok, then I suggest you add this to your watch later and come back to it when you are done. Those who are familiar with my channel know that my most popular and longest video by far was one where I made a concept for the final game in the Infamous series. This video will be very similar to that, as I will be laying out my ideas for where I think the God of War games should go next and how I think that this next saga should conclude. However, this video will differ from the Prodigal Son video in two major ways. One, this video is a lot shorter, so obviously I didn't go the whole write out the whole game route that I did with Prodigal Son. This is partly because this time around I'll be laying out my ideas for the next two games, so I won't have time to talk about both of them in depth. But it also kind of brings me to my second reason, which is the fact that unlike with Sucker Punch and the Infamous titles, Santa Monica is not done making God of War. I made Prodigal Son because I saw an Instagram post quoting Sucker Punch where they basically said that they have no plans to revisit Infamous for the time being. With this news that Infamous was being shelved for now, or maybe even forever, I took it upon myself to make my own fictional game that concluded the story so the hardcore fans could effectively put Infamous to rest. This is almost the exact opposite of what's happening with God of War. Santa Monica has openly stated many times that they love making these games and have enough story content for a handful more titles. Naturally, this means that my ideas here have a little bit less kick than with the Infamous video because unlike Sucker Punch, Santa Monica already has their own answers to questions and a plan for the future of the story. So really, there's no need for me in this instance to figure out all the dialogue and small details when just getting my general thoughts out there is a better use of both of our time, because we all know that this video will not be how the actual games turn out. Just like with Prodigal Son, I feel the need to preface this video by saying that I am no professional at writing nor storytelling, but that does not absolve me of any criticism. If you do see any problems with my ideas, I encourage you to point them out in a civil manner in the comments so I can grow as a writer. Alright, you've waited long enough. Now, let's finally get into my ideas for what lies ahead for the God of War in the next two games that I'm calling the Pantheon Saga. God of War Ragnarok ended in a very strange way. I think that most people expected them to set up another game where both Kratos and Atreus would go to another mythology. But this wasn't really the case for at least one half of that expectation, because by the end of Ragnarok, almost everything related to Kratos was tied up nice and neat. We got some stuff about his past, everything about his present, and now we know what his future holds, as he's prophesized to be the hero of the Nine Realms. Atreus' future, on the other hand, was left very open-ended. All we really know is that he left Midgard to find out where the giants went. This is where we will be picking up from, although a few years afterward, and in another land, far from his home. Like I did with Prodigal Son, I'm going to be as realistic as I can be when it comes to these games' many aspects. The first way I'm doing that is by acknowledging that these games take time to make, and the actor who plays Atreus, Sonny Suljic, will in fact get older in this time, meaning that Atreus has to as well. How much older? Well, let's probably say about 5 years, because that's about how long it will take to make the game. In these 5 years, Atreus has non-stop been searching for the giants. He assumed early on that this search would only take him just outside of the Norse lands, but then he quickly found that the giants fled much, much further than he first anticipated. In the present, Atreus has crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean, explored most of North America, and is now entering a destroyed village that he suspects used to belong to the giants. He investigates the ruins only to find small hints of where they either left or were taken to. This leads him on a short journey to Central America, where he finally enters the lands of Mayan mythology. But before we get into that, let's first talk a little bit more about Atreus. Early on, it will be shown that Atreus has grown into his godhood a lot more than he did in Ragnarok. He now has basically full control over his transformations and can transform into many more animals. He has also mastered the art of magic, which he has taught himself and could lead to some cool and abstract combat mechanics. He is also a lot stronger now, as he possesses just a piece of the strength Kratos has, but that still makes him very strong, although this game would mainly be focused on his heart and his mind, not his strength. The final power he possesses is something that he has not yet mastered, and comes from not Kratos, but Faye. Atreus is a giant, and because of that, he dreams of the future, which lately has a lot to do with his coming journey in unfamiliar lands. For the purpose of this story, I think that these dreams should be very abstract, so both the player as well as Atreus can't really tell what they mean. This would also make the second playthrough a lot more meaningful, because you could think more about what they mean rather than only focusing on the story for a second time. When I was thinking of an Atreus solo game set in another mythological land, I had to think of some things that this game should explore. What I eventually came up with were 3 main things. First up is the obvious. This game needs to flesh out and explore the setting of Mayan mythology. Obviously, just like the other God of War games, the Mayan characters and stories are going to be slightly adapted and twisted to fit the story that needs to be told. In this case, for reasons I'll explain later, I'm also going to have the Mayan gods be a bit closer to the humans than the other gods were in the other games. And by closer, I don't mean that they are nice, but just that they have more direct contact with each other. Atreus will see this pretty early on, as he observes the humans acting as slaves to the gods directly as they prepare for what looks like a massive war. This deeply saddens Atreus, and he will almost immediately try to change the perspective of the people's minds, but it just won't work. This will be one of the main things you'll see in this game, Atreus using his heart and head to solve problems that most of the time aren't even his. This builds off of what he learned in Ragnarok, and it should be tested when he sees how ruthless these gods really are. He should have to battle with the fact that he could change things with his incredible power, but that killing gods so far has only led to death and destruction. This again builds off of his arc in Ragnarok, as he sometimes in this game will begin to think very emotionally, only to calm himself down by imagining Kratos is guiding him. Getting back to the whole Mayan thing, this game takes place in this world's equivalent of the Yucatan Peninsula, which would make the setting for this game very different from the other God of War games. For starters, this environment would be very, very green. This wouldn't offer tons when it comes to differing environments, but the land itself would be very colorful and full of life, both good and bad. The Mayans were also a pretty coastal civilization, which could be seen in this game and open up some cool aspects of exploration or possibly combat if they were to implement swimming mechanics. Lastly, there could be an explorable underworld which exists in Mayan mythology. When it comes to characters, there's a plethora of Mayan gods they could use, just like there is in every other mythology. These include, and bear with me if I pronounce these wrong, Itzamna, the god of sky and wisdom, Chak, the god of lightning and rain, Kulukan, the god of wind, Apuch, the god of death, Ikshil, the god of fertility and the moon, and Buluk Chabtan, the god of war. As is usual in the God of War franchise, most of these people would be bad, but some of them would be on Atreus' side, though it would be very few. Santa Monica could also use the many side characters and hundreds of Mayan stories for side content and to further flesh out the narrative and world of this game. The second thing that this game would explore are the exact rules of how traveling between mythologies works. If you think back to the end of Ragnarok, it's shown that Kratos got to the Norse land via boat. This may lead you to assume that all these mythologies exist within the same world, but if you think a bit deeper about how that exactly works, you'll realize that it doesn't. There are just too many contradictions between the many mythologies for me to accept that all of these characters and stories exist around the same time and all in the same world. On the other hand, if we assume that these mythologies exist on separate Earths in their own universe, all within the same multiverse, then how did Kratos so easily use a boat to sail to Norse mythology? These are the type of questions that I think need to be put to rest in this game, or at least if not in this game, the next God of War game, if we are to travel to another mythology. But that being said, here's my idea to fix those inconsistencies while still keeping things fairly simple. All this game would have to explain is that when entering a different part of the world where another mythology lies, there is an unseen veil of energy separating each of their unique areas. This would allow for three major things to be made clear. First is that travel is simple, and exactly like everyone thought it was. You could technically get in a boat or walk, and eventually, over hundreds of years, visit every mythology and every single area. Second, the effect, rules, and consequences of each mythology would be mostly contained to their own area. This gives the devs freedom to make each mythology unique and give them their own twist that don't affect the other parts of the world, but also that idea can be pushed further, and maybe in some areas time would work differently, though that's just an idea. There could also be a threshold to this energy barrier, so if you were to break it, then the effects of your area could spill out into others, which could be what happened in Greece in God of War 3. The third and final thing that could be explained is how exactly the Unity Stone worked. It could be explained that it is literally just a long distance teleportation device, not some universe jumping stone like many thought it was. All three of these serve to clarify the biggest questions God of War fans have, and I think that when these games continue into other mythologies, this is a very viable solution, although it would probably need to have more lore and explanation around it. The last and biggest thing that this game needs to focus on is something that I've already mentioned. What happened to the rest of the giants who left Jotunheim? This would be the player's main question throughout the game, and obviously I don't know what Santa Monica is planning, but with the knowledge we have now, I've thought of some ideas for how this could be resolved, as well as tie into the main theme of the game. Going into the second act, Atreus would have learned from earlier on in the game that all the giants have been imprisoned by the gods. Atreus would then make his way to one of the imprisoned giants and learn the whole story. He would be told that long ago the giants left the Norseland to flee the tyranny of Odin. Afterwards, they traveled for years until they finally found a safe, secluded area far from any other gods. This would be the village Atreus found in the beginning. They stayed in that area for years and years until one day a Mayan scout found their camp. Weeks later, the village was met with the wrath of the gods, who imprisoned all the giants and took them to their land to work as slaves. Due to the conditions of their situation, one giant named Tolfer, who just so happens to be the giant you're talking to, couldn't take it anymore and revealed the one thing that the giants had kept secret so far. He told the gods of the giants' ability to tell the future in exchange for better conditions. Of course, this backfired, and now the few giants who can tell the future are kept locked up in a secure prison only the gods know the location of, while the rest are still worked as slaves. Atreus uses this information and spends a while finding the exact location of the prison, which eventually leads him into the Mayan underworld. When he arrives in the prison, he immediately breaks out the giants and escorts them to safety. This could also be a great spot for a boss fight, where Atreus kills a god of the underworld out of self-defense, because remember, he's not trying to kill unless he has to. While escorting the giants out, Atreus gets a bit curious and asks why exactly the gods want to know the future so badly, to which the giants tell Atreus that the Mayan gods have a legend of a man that they call Godslayer, who Atreus correctly assumes is Kratos. The Mayan gods are deeply afraid of this Godslayer and wish to destroy him before they themselves are slayed. This is the war Atreus has seen the gods and Mayan people preparing for this whole time. But to make things even worse, it's not just the Mayan gods preparing for this war. This is when Atreus is told that the Egyptian gods were the ones who initially warned the Mayan gods about Kratos and his wrath throughout both Greece and Asgard. Atreus hears this news of a massive war specifically aimed at killing his father and fixates on stopping it by almost any means. This is when he mainly has to suppress his urge to kill the gods and instead tries to broker peace. This puts him on a path to try and change the gods' minds, which everyone tells him is impossible, but Atreus knows from Thor in Ragnarok that even the most broken gods can change for the better. Once he does get into contact with the gods, he explains that Kratos' assault on Greece was long ago, and now he seeks peace, not war. Additionally, he explains that what happened to Asgard was not the result of another war, but the result of self-preservation. Atreus ends his plea by telling the gods that if they try to invade the Norse land and try to kill Kratos, they will just be thrusting themselves into another war that they will lose. What results from this confrontation is not at all what Atreus expected. The gods point out that they will continue to invade exactly for the reason Atreus pointed out. They say that if there really is a god who can kill all gods, then it's best they die, because nobody should have that kind of power. Knowing his plan failed and fearing his father's death, Atreus decides that the only way he can stop the coming bloodshed is by warning Kratos. The conclusion of the game has Atreus going to free the rest of the giants, but before he does so, he is stopped by Buluk-Chabtan, the god of war. He tells Atreus that he can't have him warning Kratos of their surprise or leaving here with the giants. This starts the final boss fight, and out of self-defense, Atreus kills him. He then frees the rest of the giants, and together they leave Maya to warn Kratos of the coming war. The final cutscene is of the Mayan gods discovering the body of Buluk-Chabtan, whose chest is filled with arrows. Because he is of such importance to their war, they take him to a sacred area where he is given a second chance at life that he swears he'll dedicate to killing Atreus. The next game chronologically takes place about a year or two after the last one ended, and once again puts the focus back on Kratos. The first cutscene shows Kratos almost exactly as he's depicted at the end of Ragnarok. He is seen by basically everyone as the hero to the mortals, the god who stopped Odin's tyranny and afterwards helped rebuild the now 8 realms. The tutorial and introduction section of this game shows a big step in that rebuilding process, with Kratos traveling around killing enemies and fixing up Tyr's temple in a few different realms. The player might wonder what all this is leading up to until about an hour into the game when it's finally revealed. See, Kratos has been working these past 7 or 8 years to clean up each realm individually, but now that they're all at some level of peace, it's finally time to open all the realm gateways to allow free travel between all of the realms. But sadly, right before this can be done, the many Egyptian and Mayan gods show up to kill Kratos. Immediately, Tyr, who is right next to Kratos, recognizes these gods and asks what they're doing here. They respond that they are here to get justice for the gods that Kratos has killed and that his reign has come to an end. Tyr looks to the many Egyptian gods and asks them if Horus, the god of war in Egyptian mythology, had any involvement in this. Ra speaks up and tells Tyr that Horus is a traitor who held them back from doing what they needed to do for far too long. Ra then walks up to Kratos and tells him that the world will be safer with him gone. Kratos, being a man of few words and knowing exactly what's about to happen, strikes first. This starts a lengthy battle with Kratos fighting multiple gods and barely staying alive the majority of the time. This is eased when the realms begin to help him, again showing that they are on his side, unlike with Odin. This is also where you'll see characters like Jormungandr, Freya, a Valkyrie Thrud, and of course Tyr, all fighting to defend Kratos. This evens the odds for Kratos a little bit, but everyone knows that this won't last forever. The other gods are just too strong and numerous. The entire battle eventually comes to a climax when Kratos is fighting with Ra, and just when Kratos thinks he's about to kill him, Ra destroys the Blades of Chaos. Kratos is absolutely stunned and didn't even think that this was possible, but Ra states that he came prepared and had enough time to find a way to destroy the blades. Now, for some of you, this may come off as me changing things just for change's sake, but really, story-wise, this actually works out really well. Kratos has almost always been seen as a monster, but what better way to symbolize his final transformation to a god who fights for peace than to destroy his blades, which symbolize war. If you are curious for more of my thoughts behind why I destroyed the Blades of Chaos specifically, and about just all the other things in this video, then please consider becoming a member. Because along with a bunch of other benefits that range from priority replies to comments, to early access to videos, members who have subscribed to the Superfan tier and above get exclusive behind the scenes Q&A content, which also include my various thoughts about my videos. So if you are interested in supporting the channel, becoming a member is a great way to do so while also getting some really good benefits. After destroying the Blades of Chaos, Ra strikes Kratos, sending him directly into Tyr's temple, which is destroyed by the impact. This cuts off any sort of travel to the other realms, which effectively traps Kratos, as he doesn't really have as big of an army anymore and can't retreat to another realm. Around this time is when Tyr is seen talking to Jormungandr in the background, but it's not exactly clear what they're talking about. At the very end of this long battle, after Kratos has killed a few gods but is still vastly outnumbered and about to be killed, Jormungandr knocks Kratos into the Jotunheim Tower. While still dazed, he sees Tyr in there with him, and before Kratos can assess the situation, Tyr shoves the ready-to-activate Unity Stone directly into his hands. He then yells for him to, quote, find Horus, and while saying that, he activates the Unity Stone, and Kratos completely disappears. Cut to Atreus, who's almost finished with his journey back from Maya to warn Kratos. With him are about 24 giants, all of which are sound asleep in their temporary camp. This is when we see Atreus dreaming of the current war in Midgard, although once he wakes up, he tells himself that it was all just a nightmare. We then get a short travel sequence with Atreus leading the giants over a mountain. Once they reach its peak, the first thing they see is the horrifying sight of Jormungandr bound in chains on the Lake of the Nine. Knowing what he saw in his dreams, and now seeing this in reality, Atreus knows he was too late, but doesn't completely believe that Kratos is dead, or else the gods wouldn't have stayed. To 100% confirm what really happened though, Atreus makes a plan to release Jormungandr and try to get the full story. The next part of the game would be this exact thing, where at the end, Jormungandr is released and reveals two main things. First is that Kratos is alive, which is a huge relief for Atreus. Second is that only Tyr knows where Kratos really is, and his prison is not that far from the Lake of the Nine. Well, okay, I guess that's three things because now Atreus knows that the real Tyr is alive. After traveling to where the gods are keeping their prisoners, Atreus turns into a mouse and sneaks inside where he hears the many gods wondering what to do next and where the Godslayer went. They also mention that no matter what method of torture they try to use on him, Tyr is not talking, which is making them feel very powerless, which is never good for gods. Going deeper into this makeshift prison, he finds Freya and Mimir, who admit that they have no idea where Kratos went. They say that the last thing they saw was Jormungandr smacking Kratos into the Jotunheim Tower, and after that, he was just gone. When they asked Tyr where he went, Tyr told them that he alone would keep that secret until the time was right. This is a very strategic play by Tyr, because he knows that if he is the only one that knows where Kratos went, all the gods would focus their wrath on him. This is also an obvious contrast to what he was like in Ragnarok, which is the one thing I felt like needed to be addressed, that Tyr, the real one, is not a coward. When Atreus finally reaches Tyr's prison cell deep underground, it's more blatantly revealed by Tyr that he sent Kratos to Egypt. Jump back to Kratos arriving in Egypt via the Unity Stone. With literally no clue of his precise location or how to get back, Kratos is forced to follow Tyr's prompt and find someone named Horus. But before I progress the story further, let's first talk about Egyptian mythology, or more specifically, the gods that govern it. Just to name a few, there's Isis, the god of magic, sort of, Set or Seth, the god of chaos, Anubis, the god of death, and finally Ra, the god of gods. The reason I mention those ones specifically is because they are the ones who chose to go after Kratos. The rest of the many gods have stayed put, which leaves tons of content for Kratos to explore in Egypt, but also puts less focus on killing the entire Pantheon while you are here. This is all in an effort to align the player and Kratos' intentions, because the player is going to want to kill a bunch of gods, while Kratos isn't really going to want to do that, but he will do it if he has to. So giving both Kratos and the player the end goal of getting home so you can go kill a bunch of gods that wrongly invaded your home is a pretty good way of not spoiling Kratos' character development, but also giving the player what they want. The problem with getting back home though is that Kratos has absolutely no idea how to use the Unity Stone that he possesses. But even if he did know how to use it, Kratos chooses to follow Tyr's guidance and find someone named Horus, because he trusts that Tyr had a good reason to send him to Egypt. This is the main objective that Kratos follows for a few hours until he eventually finds a random village under siege that heavily reminds him of his worst memory.
Even in death, the memories, the visions would not fade. For how could he forget?
This is when Kratos chooses to help the village, but in the middle of this section, Kratos is attacked by Osiris, and the player is left on a giant cliffhanger. Jumping back to Atreus talking to Tyr, where Tyr explains that he forced Kratos, who he knew would eventually die due to his stubbornness, to use the Unity Stone to travel to Egypt. He did this so Kratos could find a god named Horus, who knows the Egyptian gods very well and can help Kratos defeat them. Atreus mentions that he will do basically anything to go help his father, but Tyr hits him with the reality of the situation. He sent Kratos off with the Unity Stone specifically because, to his knowledge at least, there's no quick way to follow him without it. Tyr's final words to Atreus are that if he really wants to help Kratos, he will have to find some other way to travel the world quickly because it could take months to get there on foot. With no idea what to do, Atreus decides that he will meet back up with Mimir, hoping that he may know some crazy way to travel through the world quickly. Once he does so, Mimir says he has both good and bad news. He tells Atreus that he does know a way to travel the world, although it may require him to talk to someone who doesn't love his company. Wanting some further guidance, Atreus takes Mimir, tying him on his hip just like Kratos once did, and together they make a plan to get to Svartalfheim and find Sindri. The only problem with this is that Tyr's temple was damaged by the battle in the beginning of the game and all the gateways are closed. As they're brainstorming, Atreus has another idea, but first, he notes that they must travel to a safe location. On the way, Atreus explains to Mimir what exactly happened to Kratos, so they're both caught up and both on the same page. He also explains all about his journey to Maya, and Mimir notes how much things have changed around here since Atreus left. There's also a conversation about how Kratos has been, with Mimir saying that he can't say for sure, but from what he's seen, he's doing very well, although he does really miss Atreus. Once they eventually get to a safe location, Atreus sets down Mimir and begins to go to sleep while thinking of the word Ironwood. This sends him all the way to Ironwood in Jotunheim, where he meets up with Angrboda, who, just like him, is an adult. After their initial reintroduction, they talk about their past for a couple of minutes, and it's clear that they still very much have an interest in each other. While they continue to talk, their conversation is interrupted by Fenrir, who excitedly jumps on Atreus. After their conversations and reintroductions are over with, Atreus and Angrboda use Fenrir to travel back to Midgard to get Mimir. From there, they all travel to Svartalfheim and meet up with Sindri. As a side note, in this realm there would be a giant statue of Kratos now instead of Odin, which would be very cool for Atreus to see, because in the last game the dwarves hated him, but in this one you can see that they grew to like him as soon as Odin was kicked out. In this time gap since Ragnarok, Sindri has come to terms with Brock's death, although he's not at all who he used to be. He's no longer the clean freak, neat guy, he's just like he was at the end of Ragnarok, just less angry. Currently, Sindri is a hermit in the mines of Svartalfheim, who Atreus has seen built many complex devices simply to keep a busy mind. And one of these devices was indeed a one-way ticket to quickly travel anywhere in the world, which Sindri was once going to use to run away from his problems. Obviously, Sindri didn't, although he did get rid of it by tossing into the River of Souls in Alfheim, which was his final step of acceptance. Atreus then uses Fenrir to go to Alfheim and retrieve it, and finally sees that the light and dark elves have found balance. Once the device is retrieved, they return to Sindri, who tells Atreus how to use the device. It's also here where he forgives Atreus for what happened to Brock and hands him a bow that he specifically made for him that he's been working on for years. This bow would now be Atreus' iconic weapon that would replace his regular bow that he's had this whole entire time, and would have some cool ability that changes how he plays in this game versus his Mayan solo one. There's then a conversation about what to do next, and it's decided by everyone that Angrboda will take Fenrir to the Giants camp and guide them all back to Ironwood. Sindri will stay here with Atreus' journal from Maya and help craft things to help fight against those gods, while he goes to help Kratos find Horus, who will help them find ways to take down the Egyptian ones. This is exactly what happens next, as you see Atreus activate the device, which in a blink sends him exactly where he wants to go. Because Atreus wanted to go to Kratos' exact position, he is instantly thrust into the Osiris boss fight that was left on a cliffhanger the last time you played as Kratos. And with no time for reunions, Atreus helps Kratos take down Osiris. After the battle is over, Kratos and Atreus finally have their highly anticipated reunion, where you truly see how much they have missed each other. It's also noted by Kratos that Atreus has become very powerful, and he's glad to see that he grew up to be better than he was in almost every single way. It's around this time where they also openly talk about how much they each desire to know what it was like for the other person in these last 8 or so years. So throughout the game, they'll each tell each other stories of what happened in their time apart. This experience will be kind of weird for Kratos, because usually he's the one telling stories to Atreus, but now it's kind of like this flipped scenario, where Kratos has been kind of chilling this whole time, and Atreus is the one who's been off on a journey. So he'll be interested to see how Atreus has succeeded and how he's failed. As for right now though, Kratos tells Atreus of what he has learned so far in his quest to find Horus. Atreus is happy to help on the rest of this journey and hands him a mirror back to Kratos, who ties him to his hip. Obviously, this would be massively nostalgic, because by this time, it would have been about 8 to 10 years since this dynamic was last seen, and I just think that it would be absolutely heartwarming to witness. After this point, the player would then switch off, playing as either Kratos or Atreus, who, mostly together, would be traveling around Egypt, discovering the mysteries of this world, while still slowly getting to their end goal. Along the way, they would of course get sidetracked, as well as meet many other gods and characters within this mythology. Eventually, however, they would find the hiding place of Horus that is guarded by Circuit. After defeating her, they go ahead and talk to Horus, and discover that while he is the god of war in Egypt, he does not seek it. Just like Tyr, he has vowed to try his hardest to keep the peace, although sometimes that does mean that war is necessary. Very quickly, Kratos and Atreus would learn that Horus and Tyr being very similar is no coincidence, as Tyr was the one who taught him this lesson of peace while traveling around the world. Once Horus is told of the war in the Norseland, he tells them that he knew something like that was coming and had some time to prepare. Horus spent a while designing specific weapons and armor pieces to either help offensively or defensively against the Egyptian gods. The next part of the game would have Atreus and Kratos collecting the various exotic items needed to craft these. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics of what they would each be, but I think one of them would definitely be something for Kratos that would replace his Blades of Chaos. After all of this is over and their time in Egypt is coming to a close, Horus helps them in one last way. He guides Atreus through the steps of programming the Unity Stone, which they use to travel back home after saying their goodbyes. Once they arrive back in Midgard, they see that things have only gotten worse since they left, and they need to attack as soon as they can. But before that, Atreus and Kratos meet back up with Sindri, who has prepared items that they can use to defeat the Mayan gods. This is the beginning of the final section of the game, that has the fully decked out Kratos and Atreus facing off against the remaining gods from both Maya and Egypt. Of course, they would be smart about it and use the help that they have to separate and or ambush certain gods so they aren't completely outnumbered. After taking down all of the other gods, both Atreus and Kratos would be met by two opponents, Buluk-Chabtan and Ra. Of course, Buluk-Chabtan would focus on Atreus and Ra would focus on Kratos, allowing everyone involved to have a rematch. This fight would be lengthy and serve as the final battles in the end of the game. But unexpectedly, near the end of Atreus' fight with the bloodlusted Buluk Chabtan, he is struck so hard that from Kratos' perspective, he simply disappears. You then continue to play as Kratos, who is pissed off beyond belief as he thinks that Atreus has just been killed. In this enraged state, he quickly wipes out Ra, then focuses his rage on Buluk Chabtan, who is the final fight of this saga. After both of them are brutally murdered and the fight is won, Kratos falls to the ground where he asks Mimir where Atreus is. But this is one of the few times that Mimir doesn't have an answer. After a few excruciatingly silent moments, the camera shifts to show a fully adult Atreus behind Kratos. If you were to examine him further, you would see that he has the same bow as before, but with completely different clothing. He also has some tattoos, some of which would look Japanese. After Kratos turns to see an Atreus that's nearly 8 years older than he once was, there's a moment of silence. He doesn't hesitate to hug him. Afterwards, Kratos asks where he was, and there's a transition to a younger yet still adult Atreus who's seen unconscious and tumbling through the sky until he hits a body of water. Once he regains consciousness, he swims to the surface where he sees two things: a fully intact Tyr's temple and stormy skies. Curious, he swims to the shore and inspects the realm towers, where he sees that the Jotunheim Tower is missing. From these observations, he correctly assumes that just like Jormungandr, he was hit so hard that the world tree was shaken and he was sent back in time. Not fully knowing what to do, Atreus gets in contact with someone who went through a similar experience. This is when he blows the horn to ask for Jormungandr's help, answering one of the biggest questions in God of War.
Somebody just called the serpent.
But Atreus is disappointed when he is told that there is no solution to his problem. Atreus is unaccepting of this at first, but in his new maturity, quickly understands that he must be patient if he is to see his loved ones again. He also understands that he cannot interfere with events that are yet to happen, so he decides to leave this land and therefore explore the world. But first, he wants to see something. This is when the credits roll as you travel to the Lake of the Nine dock, get on a boat, travel down river, and enter Kratos and Atreus' old home, though he does enter through the back door to avoid the Hellwalkers. While both you and Atreus both take a trip down memory lane, the ground begins to shake and a fight is heard outside. Not having time to exit, but also being kind of curious, Atreus hides to watch what happens next. Kratos then enters the house, and the cutscene of him pulling out the Blades of Chaos plays out exactly as it did in God of War 2018, but this time through the hopeful eyes of Atreus. With his quick nostalgia trip over with, Atreus exits the front of the house and pulls out the Unity Stone. After activating it and disappearing completely, the weather shifts to sunny, and current Kratos and Atreus walk into frame. The next few minutes of dialogue would serve as the final words in the conclusion of the entire God of War timeline, with them wrapping up any unfinished dialogue and tying up all the loose ends. Well, all but one. Alright, so that was the entire video. This is the end section where I'm going to talk about a few of my extra thoughts, although I don't have that many because I have a lot of that stuff in the behind the scenes video. But first off, if you couldn't tell, I was getting sick during this video, so if you did notice, I progressively got more and more sick and sounded more stuffy throughout the video. That's why. You were not going crazy. I did get sick during this video, and I tried to record on days where I felt really good, but obviously that can't happen all the time, so I did sound a little weird. Secondly is if I did get anything wrong with the mythologies, I apologize for that. I did have very limited time to do research for this video, but I really did try to get everything pretty accurate to the mythologies. Although I know that there are a bunch of contradictions, like there are with many mythologies, I tried to kind of streamline it like these games often do. But if I did get anything really wrong, I will pin a comment down below. The last thing I wanted to say is just a big thank you to everyone who watches the channel and therefore supports it, and a bigger thank you to all the members who financially support this channel. As I grow on YouTube, members are increasingly becoming the best way for me to know directly what my audience wants to see, and also they really help creatively with the videos, because I can directly just ask you guys, hey, is this a good idea? Or is this the type of video you want to see? Just kind of stuff like that. So if you want that kind of connection with the channel, or if you want to just support me financially, or if you want some bonus content that I don't really feel like fits in with the main channel content, then just become a member. And it's pretty simple, you get some good benefits, and it's the best way you can support me as a creator. But other than that, thank you guys so much for a wonderful year on YouTube. I've grown so much this year, my content has grown a lot, and just I cannot wait to see what happens next year. So thank you guys so much, and let's see where this goes in 2023.